And thank you to those in the room for coming out, and thank you for those online for coming out. If you're online, make sure you are loading up on coffee, because the coffee and the treats are in the room and I can't throw them through the Zoom camera to you. So you heard, I'm Paul Armsworth. I'm with University of Tennessee, Knoxville. You have my email up there. I was delighted when Louise agreed to help give the presentation this morning. So Louise Vaughn is going to be presenting with me. I'm thrilled Louise is going to do it. One thing that Louise and I are both very conscious of, though, is that what we were asked to talk about, what we were asked to share with you today, is actually, it's not Louise's work, it's not Paul's work. It is a huge collaborative effort reaching across many colleagues from states and territories, from CCASC, from CICUS, from universities, and more broadly. So, like for me, I was given a presentation at a different university on Monday, and it was all Paul and his student stuff. That is the antithesis of what this is. This is, I was asked to come along, and Louise was asked to come along to chat to you about what has been a collective effort, but many other colleagues could be up here giving this talk. You know many of them. Some of you contributed to the things that are in here, and so we're very aware of that we're representing other individuals and that they would be equally well positioned to do this, and better than me for sure. What we were asked to talk about was an effort that CCASC, so you're in the CCASC Science Seminar, and CICUS, our sister institution, and other institutions put together to try to support states and territories as they were thinking about their wildlife action plans. Many of them in the Southeast were undertaking a revision of those. We were looking at how we might be able to support that effort. So that's what we're going to be describing to you this morning. Just by way of an outline, so you're going to hear from Louise, first of all. She'll talk about CICUS, our sister center. She'll talk to you about what was this wildlife action planning effort, and then what the two centers put together to try to support our state and territory partners. I will then walk through with you a little bit just of the concrete, the tangibles. What did people get? So you can get a sense of that. And then we'll have some take-homes from the overall effort. So that's sort of the running order we're going to have. So those who are getting their entertainment already from the auto captioning Myra described, it loves Scots. It always loves Scots. So if you've been distracted by that already, I'm now going to let Louise talk for a bit, and it will actually translate crisply and perfectly. And then I'll be the comedy hour at the end.
Hello to everybody in the room and online. I'm Louise Vaughn, and I do have an office here at NC State campus. And I would like to call out my colleagues, Hillary Morris and Amy Keister, who I also work with. And we'd like to thank NC State for hosting us here and giving me the opportunity to talk about a project that's been many, many years in the making. And as Paul said, it is a collective project that all of our staff contributed to, and would not have been possible without the partnerships and relationships that CCASC has been able to create over the years. But before I get started on this presentation and started talking about state wildlife action plans, I actually wanted to talk about these two concepts that have really stuck in my mind over the years. And I think at CCASC, at our partnership, we think about these things a lot. And the first is this book that was published in 2004 called The Inmates Are Running the Asylum, which is a phenomenal title. It's actually a great title. And really what this book is about is Alan Cooper, the author, after the .com era, sat around and thinking a little bit about some things that he had noted in the technology sector, which is you had all these developers, phenomenally smart, brilliant people who were really pushing the arena of data sciences and technology, yet they were really bad at delivering that science and technology to people. It was difficult to access, it was difficult to understand. And so he kind of noted that you can have really powerful developers, really smart, intelligent developers, but that is different when you think about the user experience, UI, UX professionals, and how they design tools for access to be meant to be understood, apps to be intuitive, technology to be intuitive to the average user. And so sometimes developers, we can't pretend that we don't know what we do know. And it could be hard to translate that information back out to the general public. And I think about that a lot because it really kind of guided and helped inspire and invigorate a whole new discipline of user experience, user-centered design. The other thing I think about a lot, maybe more than I should actually, is this. I heard once in a presentation that we put a man on the moon before we put wheels on a suitcase. And that, of course, like we always think like, oh, we always overlook these like simple, easy designs that are most likely to help us. But when I researched this a little bit, what really struck me is that this guy, he had this idea when he was going through an airport with his 2 young children and wife. If you've ever traveled with your family, you know that that is one of the most stressful things a person can do. You need help. You need to make it as easy as possible. But what really, really strikes me about this example is that Bernard Sato owned a luggage company. He was president of a luggage company. So one would think that he thought about luggage all the time. He knew the specs, he knew the materials, that he would be, this is something he was thinking about a lot, but he did not have this idea until he was living the traveler's experience. He was doing the task that luggage is meant to do. And there he was in the airport. I imagine people were upset. He was trying to be patient and he just wanted an easier way to do it. And he found empathy with the traveler and that experience and came up with this idea in 1970. So these are 2 concepts that I want us to be thinking about throughout the course of this presentation and just to be thinking about it because it really guided a lot of our work. So CCAS. CCAS is a regional conservation partnership that spans 15 Southeastern states and the 2 US Caribbean territories of Puerto Rico and US Virgin Islands. We were started in 2011 by the member states of the Southeastern Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. So we were started really out of the recognition by the states that conservation planning really needed to add up to something, and that if we are ever going to tackle the big landscape level challenges that we all face, we needed to work together. I think the Southeast has been a really wonderful place and has a strong history and culture and partnership, and this is really embodied in the CCAS partnership. We do have a steering committee that is comprised of 5 state directors of fish and wildlife agencies and the Southeast Fish and Wildlife Service Regional Director. So that they kind of set our North Stars, they help to guide us. And we also have points of contact that represent all of our 15 states and territories, as well as federal agencies with natural resource authorities in the Southeast, a couple of nonprofits, and Native American Fish and Wildlife Society. So these folks are helpful and help serve as our think tank for CCAS. So this is ultimately how we are governed, and we also have 6 staff people. Everything about CCAS is really driven by our vision of a connected network of lands and waters for the benefit of nature and for people, and by our goal, which is a 10% or greater improvement in the health, function, and connectivity of Southeastern ecosystems by 2060. It drives all of our work. This is what we are really all about at CCAS. And the conservation blueprint, the Southeast Conservation Blueprint, is our living spatial plan that we hope will get us towards our vision and make progress on our goal. The Southeast Conservation Blueprint, we update it fairly regularly, typically on an annual cycle. But basically what this is doing, it is identifying areas for priority for that connected network of lands and waters. It covers roughly 50% of our lands and waters across the Southeast. This is a completely data-driven plan based on a suite of cultural and natural resource indicators that span terrestrial, freshwater, and marine ecosystems. We have about roughly 60-ish indicators that span across the Caribbean and the Southeast continental. And so this plan, we have staff people on hand to help you use this plan, to help understand this plan, but to also dive a little bit deeper. There's a couple of things that we ask people to keep in mind about the Southeast Conservation Blueprint. This is a living spatial plan. It does change over time. We update it based on the best available science and the needs of our community and our users. What do people want to see reflected back into it? It is also recognizing these areas in purple. What we're saying here is places within these within these various colors, these are the best places for conservation action in order to make progress on our vision, a connected network of lands and waters. We take a broad definition of what a conservation action could be. It could be management, it could be policy, it could be outreach and education, it could be restoration, prescribed fire, it could also be acquisition. But also that this plan is meant to be used in complement with local data sets. It's not meant to be used in isolation. It's meant to serve as a regional lens of conservation. And we do have staff on hand to help you dig in and define the places that people really care about, where they're familiar and where they're trying to employ conservation actions, and tell how those local strategies can make an impact both locally in local communities, but also contribute to a regional conservation strategy. At CCAS, over our 15-year history, we have had an impact. So we have involved more than 2,500 people from almost 700 different organizations. What this means is that these are people that have served on our governance. They have used the Southeast Conservation Blueprint. They have given us guidance. They have worked with us. They have given us feedback and participated with us. And I want to give a big shout out to Hillary Morris, who does all of our tracking. So if you've ever worked with CCAS, we know you. We want to get to know you better, but you also go into this number. The blueprint itself has also been used to guide 368 projects, with another 33 still in progress right now. These are people we are actively helping. And over our history, we have helped bring in, our conservation partners bring in over $400 million to conserve and restore over 410,000 acres across the Southeast. And one of my favorite things about this number is because we do this tracking, we know these people who have really made a difference. And a lot of that has been our state agency partners. Really quickly, I want to talk about who these 2,590 people are from these various organizations. So what I'm showing you right now, and I want to give a big shout out to Amy Keister, who came up with a way to visualize this concept, is that each one of these circles and dots represents a person who has participated with CCAS. The color of the dot aligns with what type of organization they are from. The larger the dot, the larger their involvement and engagement. So we can point to this big dot right here, and this is Anna Smith from South Carolina Department of Natural Resources. Hello, Anna, if she's online. She's a rock star. But you can see that within our whole ecosystem of the people that we work with, state agencies are really the core of our partnership. And this is an important group of people that we seek to serve. And a couple of years ago, CCAS staff really started thinking about how we could best serve our state agencies. Every 10 years, as mandated by Congress, actually, each state and territory needs to revise their state wildlife action plan. This has been happening since 2005, 10-year revision cycle. So we're on about our third revision. Although different states have different timelines from time to time. I think Florida's done, I think in the past, like a 3-year revision cycle. So each state can do it differently, but at least every 10 years, they need to revise their state and wildlife action plans. These state and wildlife action plans are really amazing repositories of science and knowledge and work. So North Carolina's was just recently submitted to the Fish and Wildlife Service in order to get approval to receive state and tribal wildlife grants. This is how it works. But that North Carolina State Wildlife Action Plan is a composite of many, many, many hours of work. And North Carolina, for example, did not do that in a vacuum. They reached out across partnerships, across universities, across experts to inform their plan. So I think of these plans as they've been developed by the states, but they're everybody's plan. We all live in a state or territory. These are everybody's plan, and they're really meant to drive the conservation of species and to help make sure that we're not losing things and that we're managing things. A common thing we hear from our state partners are keeping common things common. We don't want to lose things. Also, if you see a state biologist who has worked on a state wildlife action plan, you should buy them the drink of their choice. These things are hard. They are unique to every state, but they're an amazing body of work. And so a couple of years ago, staff at CCAS was really thinking like, how can we support our partners in this? Can they use the blueprint? Would that be helpful to them? Can we connect them with other data sets? Can we work with other partners? How can we make their lives a little bit easier, but also help to inform these state wildlife action plans? Really quickly, the only guidance for state wildlife action plans officially is that they adhere to 8 required elements. I'm not going to go over each one of these elements because I think you can kind of understand it in 2 primary ways. A large part of the elements is understanding what is the wildlife and the habitats that they depend upon, and what are the threats and conservation actions you can do to manage these species. One of the biggest things that the states do is they identify species in greatest need of conservation, species in greatest conservation need. I messed that up, it's SGCN. But these species are the priority species of the states, but they're also priority species for a lot of us for various reasons. But these are the species where we want to really focus conservation action. And a lot of this is about what are the actions we can take? How can we minimize threats to these species? And the other really important part of the 8 required elements is that states do work with partners, that they work with federal agencies, they work with other state agencies, they work with tribes, and that there is a point of public review where the public can weigh in on state wildlife action plans. So I sit on a wildlife diversity committee of CIAFWA, and what this is, it is committee of SWAP coordinators. It is committee of state biologists that are focused on non-game species and help give guidance back to state directors. And we were thinking about SWAPs and how we could benefit from them. Keep in mind that each state develops their own SWAP, so they're unique to the state, which is appropriate to the unique ecosystems and species of each state. But also, if we're thinking about the entire CCAS region, that's 15 different state wildlife action plans. So if you're focused on a more regional landscape, how can we create consistency across these plans to take better advantage of large national conservation funding or competitive CSWIG grants, state wildlife grants, things like that? And so as this group was talking, we were thinking a little bit like, well, is there anything we can do to make SWAPs a little bit more consistent? And for CCAS, we were thinking like, well, gosh, if we help one state in one way, we'd like to be able to extrapolate that out to other states. Is there a consistent service that we could provide to a lot of our state partners? And also one thing, a rule of thumb at CCAS is that we don't actually want to make novel or new data sets. We want to draw on the good work of others and promote the existing science. Publicly, regularly maintained information is typically what informs all of our products, the blueprint and other products of CCAS. And we also wanted it to be doable. We're not trying to kill ourselves or our state partners. So what could we do in this time frame and what could we help out? Well, the first thing we did is we administered a survey to all of our SWAP coordinators. What types of information are they using in the SWAP? What's good? What's easy in their SWAP? What do they like? What are the big challenges? And how do they address these 8 required elements? And what we found are really, again, and this was not a shocker to anybody, is that most states don't consider any part of revising their SWAP to be easy to accomplish. They are hard. They require a lot of time and resources. But what was most challenging for them were identifying or updating their species of greatest conservation need, their SGCN, incorporating climate change information, and then identifying threats and conservation actions and developing habitat classifications. This is what was coming out of that small survey we did. Of course, having a great relationship with CCASC, our sister agency of a similar sounding acronym, we shared this information with them in particular, which was incorporating climate change information was a big challenge for our state partners. One of the things we heard back when we presented this information to a lot of the climate change scientists working in the Southeast was, but why? There's a lot of information out there. We are providing lots and lots of information. Why is it a challenge to incorporate it into climate change? And this started to lead to a really wonderful collaboration between CCAS and CCASC. There's the emphasis. So in short, what we decided to do at CCAS is to write an additional chapter for any state that was interested for their state wildlife action plan. And this chapter would be focused on how each state fit into the regional landscape. We drew from things like the conservation blueprint and other data sources like the regional species of greatest conservation need, which is a data set that the states had worked really hard to develop, which said across our 15-state region, across all of our different species of greatest conservation need, what are our regional priorities? So we did use that information as well. So we always try to draw from the existing data, and these chapters are consistent. They're standardized, they scale to the state, but they are also customized for each state. And within that, we also took a lens to looking at resiliency, and that's something that Paul is going to speak about in a little bit. So one of the reasons why we wanted to do this is we really, really wanted, and Paul, I think this is probably yours too, but anyway, one of the things that we really wanted to do is we wanted to write these chapters ourselves. And that is because, again, state biologists, SWAT coordinators, their plates are full. So we were going to take on the ownership of writing these chapters. But that also put us in the position of being the people at the airport with our upset kids and significant others. We got to test out a lot of the science that we were delivering to them, and we were able to build empathy with the states and what they were facing. So we were able to contribute added capacity and dedicated staff time. But I do want to emphasize, we did not give them the data. We interpreted it, summarized it, and gave it to them. And developing these chapters was a lot of back and forth with the states. I want to call out special attention for the state of South Carolina, Anna Smith again, who agreed to be a test pilot for us for these regional chapters and spent a lot of time saying, I do like this, I don't like this, this is what we really need it for. And a lot of our state partners did that. They were very frank with us and gave us really good feedback. So we made sure that the template for this chapter that we were delivering was something that was right and something that resonated with the user need. So we worked really, really closely, but Paul also was running monthly calls at the same time, doing the same things. And so when we say that these chapters are a huge repository of work, it is our state partners, people who gave feedback, the researchers and the PIs and everybody at the universities that contributed information, as well as other nonprofits, as well as other groups that were really looking at this and helping us with this. And we also had regular updates and participation during the annual conference, the SIAFA Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies annual conference that occurs every year in October to give updates on what we were doing. And so for regional chapters, I just wanted to kind of give a snapshot of what was in there. So again, we usually included a map of the blueprint that occurred in the states. But one of the things that we heard from our state partners is that they didn't want a map that just ended at their state lines. They were curious about what was going on right across the boundaries, what their neighbors were doing, because they might have species of greatest conservation need occurring here that would be influenced in a watershed slightly upstream of them. And they wanted to have that sense. And so this concept of an extended boundary around the states, this is something that came from the states. Show me what's right over my borders that I should be paying attention to while I manage within my own state boundaries. We also broke down regional species of greatest conservation need. So what this chart is showing you right now is in the state of South Carolina, how many of these regional species of greatest conservation need by taxa does it share with other states? Obviously, your neighbors, you tend to share a lot with your neighbors, but also places like Virginia and Florida, other states where you could potentially do a competitive state wildlife grant where you can find commonality. And so this was kind of, again, we were taking a list that they created and just analyzing it and summarizing it in a different way. And these are a couple of sentences that I took out of that chapter itself to give you a sense of the narrative that we were creating for them as well. And then also, when it comes to helping states integrate climate change, there was a couple of recommendations out for the National Association for Fish and Wildlife Agencies, AFWA, about what to do. But there's two questions that really drove me. And these questions actually came from Cindy Smith here in North Carolina. And basically, when she's thinking about climatic changes and changes to our landscape, what she really wanted to know is where will the habitats and species shift and move going forward into the future? Which is a very simple question. Where are things going? Where are they moving? Where should I think about managing in the future? And how do we manage for that change? And this really drove a lot of our collaboration with the CASC and thinking about how to deliver that information. Can we answer these two things? Can we give any insight into these two things? And so, and our questions to the CCASC partners itself, and this gets a little bit more into Paul's work and the CASC's work of how can we show these past and future conditions easily and at the right scales. There are some tools we came across that were really fantastic, but they were only for specific points. These are state level plans, so we needed to think a little bit bigger. Also, what kinds of information can we use? How do we interpret it? How can we use this? And a lot of the questions we were getting is the states were, can you help us analyze and summarize information so we could write a sentence? And that is the trick. How can you take a table and say, this is what it is telling me, this figure and what it is telling me? Paul, this leaves it to you.
Thank you, Louise. Right, so I'm just going to walk through some visuals of what it is they received from this. So what went into some of these chapters. You've seen a bit of it already from Louise. It is all the intelligence of taking images out of the PDF itself. These are out of the chapters. Now, what that does mean, and particularly for those online, those in the room are going to be squeamish about doing it because they'll think they're distracted. But those online, I've taken them from the Tennessee swap. So you can see the Tennessee swap link up there. You can see an image of the relevant chapter. You're up online. You're sitting in a state or territory. So my encouragement is open up your state or territory swap in real time and look for the same things that I'm going to be showing in here for Tennessee. And you'll find that because of that coherence and structure, you should find similar things to what we're describing. So what did they receive? First thing that we put in from the CCASC side to this was just the physical climate change projection information. What might be coming to states under climate change? And it went in tabular form, it went in graphical form, it went in narrative form. So you will see figures like this. This is, as I say, from Tennessee swap. Looking, here's one of the examples. There are plenty of others in there. This one is an increase in numbers of days of extreme heat. And you'll already see some of the challenge that you face when talking about climate change projections. They are projections. We don't know what is going to happen. We don't know truth 20 years out. A lot of that depends on choices that society makes. So we're trying to include some of that uncertainty when presenting this kind of information. So you'll note the figure is provided at two different levels of global warming. That's indicating two different future emission scenarios. How intensively will we emit greenhouse gases in the future? And we're trying to give you a sense of what the spatial pattern might look like under each of those. A less intensive scenario and a more intensive scenario. And you can imagine if you were sitting in Tennessee, you'd be looking over at the western side of the state and saying, not liking the look of some of those extreme heat days over on the western side of the state at the slightly higher warming level. That's for extreme heat. There's plenty of other figures like this. So this time extreme precipitation, same sort of structure. So less intensive greenhouse gas emissions, slightly more intensive. And again, trying to give some sense of where within the state we might see the greatest increase. You're looking for the darker colors in days facing extreme precipitation. So breaking it down spatially for them. That's a graphical version. And as I say, I hope by now, at least some online have got Google up and they've found them and they're finding these for their own states. But there's also tabular versions of the same thing. So here, taking Tennessee and breaking it straight out of the Tennessee swap, breaking it down by ecoregions of Tennessee, and let's go on, breaking it down, and then looking at, as you saw from the questions Louise put up, what's the historical signal, what might be coming over the next 25 years, what might be coming further out in time. And again, though, we don't know their projections. So we're trying to give a sense, a bound on what might be coming here at different intensities of emission. So low emission scenario, moderate emission scenario, a higher emission scenario. And so you can already see it sort of multiplying up. And one tension that played out all the way through, it's one of the challenges was sort of balancing between, and there's some faces in here looking very carefully at me, the desires from the climate science community to show that variation, to show the variation in different assumption sets about emission scenarios, actually even different models used to produce the kinds of predictions that are there, that this multiplies up very, very quickly, then turning around to our state partners and presenting them with this giant smorgasbord of data and finding they weren't delighted. So there was also this sort of challenge of how do we distill it down? What's a comfortable balance between honestly reflecting the uncertainty and bounding what might be coming with giving a distillation that isn't overwhelming? And that's something we were sort of grappling with all the way through. So the first thing they got was sort of physical climate information. But you saw from Louise the 8 required elements that were in a state or territory wildlife action plan. And you saw right out of the gate, species of greatest conservation need. So we also wanted to try to connect the climate impacts to what might the species see. Now, in trying to do that, there are many different ways of doing it. We featured 2 that seemed most common to us. One we know was common because there was actually a review done by CCASC after the previous swamp rounds, and this was the most common thing that people used to, states and territories used to connect up then climate information to species vulnerability. It's a trait, primarily an expert judgment trait-based index that was developed by a group called NatureServe. The CASCs have actually sponsored an update of this tool. So this is still around, it's being updated, it's being renewed. It's called Climate Change Vulnerability Index, CCVI. And it combines a few different things. There's some direct exposure information, meaning you draw a blob on a map that you think, this is a region that is of interest for the species I'm talking about. Thinking about the kind of physical climate data I was just showing, what temperature change might be coming inside there, what precipitation change might be coming inside there. And that's reflected in this tool as direct exposure. But people wanted a lot more than that reflected in how they thought about species vulnerability. So there is then an exercise that groups of experts would gather in a room, people who had the taxonomic expertise, and they were doing, based on expert judgment and what data they had, but subjective scoring of a whole range of traits people thought would be important for how vulnerable a species was to climate change. So an example might be, what is the historical thermal niche? How variable is its historical thermal niche? Is this a species that through time has seen lots of different climate variation? Maybe it spans a lot of different elevations. That's a species that we might think, okay, it can probably cope with a range of climates moving forward. Or is this something that's very constrained? Another one might be dispersal or movement. Is this a species that can move quite freely, or is this one that's got strong dispersal constraints? Again, that might talk to us about how vulnerable or not we think the species is going to be. So nature sort of developed this thing. Many of you will have done these exercises. You will have been in the rooms. You take these scores, you pour them into a giant spreadsheet exercise, and it spits out vulnerability scores. This, as I said, it was done by a number of states in our region. It was done by other organizations. So the old Appalachian LCC did one, a national park did one. We reached out beyond just our region because some of the surrounding states had species that were on our RSGCNs, our SGCN lists. So we thought there might be information in there too. We just did the boring thing. This was done by students with me in a class. We were collating just the scores and the evaluations different groups had put together, made a giant spreadsheet of them. It's up on Sciencebase. You can go and have a look at it. We made a little YouTube video of how can you use this spreadsheet. And what did we arrive at? We arrived at estimates for 800 species, and it was about 1,600 estimates overall. You can already see some of the patterns. So the most obvious one, taxonomic coverage varies. More estimates for birds, fewer estimates over here. Because this was coming up the States, we probably are reflecting the biota fairly well for what's in the SGCN list. I'm always conscious of the bars that never made it onto the chart because we haven't even started to look at those. But still, at least we are reflecting things that were important to our states and partners. You can also see that these estimates, people are concerned, these scores are signaling concern about some taxonomic groups to climate vulnerability more than others. So again, look at the intensity of the color this time. The mussels, a lot of concern about our mussel species being vulnerable to climate change coming out from these assessments. Other invertebrates, plants, also concerns, fish are concerned. In contrast, despite all the attention we give them, less concern perhaps for birds, less concern perhaps for our mammals. So different groups showing differential vulnerability. So that was one way that was one set of information we collated about how people think of species vulnerability to climate change. The academics, so as I say, that's been favored a lot, I think, by the state agencies, did that in the previous swaps round. Some of the federal agencies were involved. The academics have tended to go in a different direction. The most common thing I would argue that the academic literature has done for trying to get at this question of how vulnerable are different species, large numbers of species, to potential climate change is a method that I know as ecological niche models. You might know them as species distribution models. You might know them as correlative niche models, maxent models, and on it goes. So giant bag of synonyms for the same thing. Right, I'm going to explain what it does. It's not very complicated. Take a species you care about, like my little salamander here, over near the North Carolina-Tennessee border. Go and find where we know that species has occurred in recent times. My little triangles are places where we know that species occurs. Take those data and then compare them to climate information. So comparing here to frost days, mean annual temperature, winter mean temperature, evaporation, and the bag would go on, right? I just stopped putting up on the slide. It would be down through the floor or something. But get a big collation of climate variables, and then you just want to ask, what do the triangle locations have in common that the surrounding areas don't? Because that's going to tell us that's probably a set of climate conditions this species likes to have. We use software to do it. The most popular software is a machine learning algorithm called maxent. Many of you will have used it. So this is running that example through maxent. And the dark green then are places where we're seeing climate conditions similar to what's at the triangles. Now, you can see it hugs the triangles pretty closely, but you get places, sorry if I'm pointing in the room, I don't know if you're seeing that on the screen, you get places where the dark green sort of stretches a bit past the triangles, where we're saying the climate conditions over there also look similar, even though we don't know if the species has been found there or would be found there, but similar climate conditions nearby. That's how you use a tool like this to think about current distributions of species. But when you run a tool like this, you get back a model that's the association between where the species is and what the climate conditions are. So we can then take the kinds of tabular information you saw, the kind of graphics you saw about what the physical climate change might be, and swap out these variables for the projected climate change. So we then take our model fit and we swap out the historical climate data for future potential climate data. We take it from global circulation models. It has assumptions about greenhouse gas emissions, but we can say, if that climate future happened, what might conditions look like for our salamander? And so here's one example, and you can see it's pretty pessimistic in this case. We lose a lot of the dark green. So that's a situation where we would say, this is a species we think looks relatively vulnerable to climate change. Doesn't always look like that. Sometimes the green might grow bigger. Sometimes the green might move. But this one is an example where we say relatively more vulnerable, and you can use this approach then to score different species based on how much gain or loss in suitable area you might be expecting. So that's what's very common in the scientific literature. We, again, just did the obvious thing. We went to the literature and we collated estimates for this and tried to corral them. They're a little heterogeneous in the methods. We tried to corral them to a single sort of consistent scoring systems, again, led by students at Tennessee. It's not exhaustive. We focused on studies spanning the Southeast that had a reasonable number of species in each study. There are a lot of singletons, and we would have run out of steam if we tried to run down all of them. I did one niche model for one species. But we still got to 1,800 species, 3,000 estimates. Again, it's up on ScienceBase. You can see this time the taxonomic coverage is not as good. And the variation, so a lot of plants, mostly it's trees. But you again see variation in its taxonomic coverage, and again, vulnerability varying across the groups. Right, so that's the data resource that we use to support lots of different state and territory wildlife action plans. What we would do is we would take a state SGCNs, the species they had said was most important, we would go to those two data resources and we would distill out, okay, well, for your SGCNs, what does CCVI say about relative vulnerability? For your SGCNs here, again for Tennessee, what do the niche models that we can find in the literature say about vulnerability? I have to give a qualifier if you've been watching carefully. Mussels weren't on the previous slide. Tennessee, for good reasons, were very interested in mussels, and a study came out after we'd done the distillation. So we ran back to the literature to make sure we could get that one in as well. So that is sort of quant summaries, but it's quite aggregated. As you heard from Louise, we also wanted to support the narrative writing. Now, I want to be very careful here. The state and territory wildlife action plans are authored by the states and territories. We were trying to help. So we were offering text, but as grist to the mill. And there were steps that happened after the text flowed from us. So we would go to them. Some of you had these conversations with Louise, with my colleague Haley, who's not on with us today, but was influential in all of this work. And people would, and other colleagues and states or territories were invited to suggest, can't do the whole of the biota, but if you want some narrative help and managing the literature, is there a taxon you're particularly interested in? For Alabama, it was reptiles. For US Virgin Islands, it was insects. For Georgia, it was shoreline birds. For Tennessee, it was mussels. Now, I'm working in here, others are working in here. We don't have taxonomic expertise that covers all of that, but we do know how to navigate the literature a bit. So we would go in, we would distill then more richly, not just CCBI and niche, but what else do we have in the literature? What do we have by way of studies exploring in that place for that taxon, potential vulnerability to climate, potential management actions, and trying to pull that body of work together in narrative form. That then flowed out. So we would then, so these are pages from the Tennessee swap where the draft text, several drafts back, but the draft text, then you'll find some of it coming through and helping support this more narrative type approach. Some of it's still tabular. So here, this is for the mussels. You've got the CCBI and the niche estimates, but also IUCN, ESA, NatureServe estimates. And that table, because if you know your Tennessee mussels, that goes down for many, many pages. So pulling this information together to try to support our state and territory partners, in this case, it then flowed, so then going out with the text to taxonomic experts. Here, so a big shout out to Brittany Bio-Walker, who's the state malacologist. Our draft went to Brittany, who then worked over it and said, okay, pretty good, you guys get like a B+. Here's the detail you missed about mussel taxonomy and systematics that you really need to make this thing go. So trying to help, but also getting as close as we can and then relying on more detailed taxonomic expertise. One thing we heard a lot in the exercise was, you've told us climate's important, you've connected it to species and ecosystem, what can I do? And that's a place where I would say, as the literature, and as Summer and others, we need to do better. There were, like I can say, a lot of states saw the same example. We did find examples, and a big shout out to some CCASC colleagues. So some of you online will have been in this project. So John Cupford at South Carolina, Adam Tarando, who's with the center, and colleagues had a really neat example of what this can look like. So this is trying to tie the climate change information to the types of decisions and actions that managers in our states and territories are taking. Here they tied it. I wasn't involved, but I think it's a fantastic project. This is from the Tennessee swap. So this has gone out as part of that regional chapter. You'll find versions in other. You might find it if you're up online in your state chapter. What they did is they tried to tie those physical climate conditions to the windows, the date windows when prescribed fire is a viable management strategy. So that's a decision. Where shall I put my fire crews? How shall I allocate resources for that states and territories were facing quite frequently? And so here, this is then being connected directly to potential climate information. And you can see it's not the greatest resolution on the image for you, but if you look over in West Tennessee in the summer, you'll see it starts to thin out in color, meaning that there are fewer days in the summer period when West Tennessee is suitable for burning, prescribed fire. The same thing happens over on some of the coastal areas as well. You see this thinning out. So that's an example of what it means to tie some of this information to management actions. And I applaud my colleagues who brought that work forward. It's the sort of thing we need a lot more of. Okay, so some take homes from the overall effort. I think it's fair to say the feedback we've had from states and territories is that they welcomed the work we did. They found the outputs useful. The feedback we received has been pretty positive. They've disabled the chat. So states and territories, you can't stick into the chat. Paul's lying. It was terrible. But hopefully you found them useful. If it was useful, and I say the feedback we've had suggested it was useful, then I would argue the collaboration, the communication was absolutely critical. So this was states and territories working with CCAS, working with CCAS, working with researchers. It was very, very collaborative, and the comms were crucial to that. The other thing that's crucial to that is states and territories' needs drove the process. This was not a bunch of researchers showing up with the idea, here is what you need. No, this is a bunch of researchers and others showing up saying, how can we help you? But some hard lessons for us, perhaps. Sometimes the data we were after were available, but they had to be dug out of the literature. I'll pick on the niche models as an example. I looked at what went into the 2015 plans carefully. Niche models weren't there. I also looked at the literature. Niche models were in the literature at that time that could have been used. Sometimes the data are available, but they're not being carried through to the users the way we need to do that. Sometimes distillations of the data had been done, but not always in the most useful form. But perhaps most troubling was sometimes the data just weren't there. And the most obvious one being bias in taxonomic coverage. So some of the species and the groups people are most concerned about, particularly in our aquatics, we were not finding enough data for. Also, more examples, future climate change, climate vulnerability, to management actions. What would a manager do? More examples like that needed. Where I wanted to finish, so you've heard, we've said a lot of times, developing these plans, they were a huge team effort. What we've been describing is a tiny piece where CCAS, CCAST, and colleagues were trying to help. But a plan is just a document. It's a plan. Implementation is what matters. And yes, Georgia, I know yours is a bit fancier. We like you, Georgia. But, my encouragement to everybody, all of you online as well, read your state and territory wildlife action plan. You are all in a state or territory. Read your state or territory wildlife action plan. You will learn a whole lot. Find things in there you like, and then spread word. Share it with colleagues. And at that point, reach out to your state or territory DNR and ask how you and your colleagues can help as we move from plan to implementation, because that's what actually matters. With that, just a huge thank you to all of the state and territory DNR staff and the wider network of people in each state who took part in preparing the wildlife action plans. Big thank yous to the many people. Like, this should go on for way through the floor. I started typing names, and at some point I ran out of steam. But everyone who contributed to what Louise and I were showing you today, thank you very much. I'm hopeful we have time for a question.
Thank you so much, Paul.
Questions in the room, just